Night City is a godless place. CD Projekt Red's Night City specifically is a depiction of a world in which people have fully abandoned hope of the benevolent divine. And after abandoning the divine, our leaders are next in line to be God, and they too have proven all but benevolent. Expanding on Mike Pondsmith's original lore, CDPR uses Cyberpunk 2077 to paint a picture of an America that is post-theodic, of a people that no longer trust in benevolence at all, frankly. So let's actually take a quick step back and define theodicy. And no, I'm not saying the Odyssey by Greek poet Homer, I'm talking theodicy, a theological argument used to try and reconcile the idea of an omniscient, omnipotent, and benevolent God with the existence of profound human suffering. In short, it is an answer to the problem of evil. But in Night City, people have given up hope in benevolence. There are believers in God in Night City, but they stand on street corners warning of his wrath. The only God left is an angry one. To talk about this, I'll start by outlining the history of the Cyberpunk timeline and the events that lead up to this abandonment of divine goodness, then look at the ways it manifests within the game itself, and I'll close with a reflection on what this says about our current world. So first, let's have a quick history lesson. Looking at the century leading up to 2077 itself provides a lot of context and potential explanations for the state of humanity in 2077. Now, this is not a comprehensive lore video, but I'll link the sources I'm summarizing down below. Cyberpunk's timeline really starts to diverge from ours right before the 21st century, during the Quiet War in the 90s. The European Economic Community, or the EEC, allied itself with the USSR via humanitarian aid, fracturing its relationship with the United States and ultimately dissolving NATO. In retaliation, the United States tampered in the global economy by hacking into European and Asian stock markets to tank the value of the newly introduced eurodollar, and make the American economy look strong in comparison. This kind of economic warfare would ultimately prove disastrous though, as when the EEC discovered the tampering and leaked the information, the US was embargoed by nearly every major world power, and this would start a long line of political disasters that would dramatically reduce the American quality of life. Skimming over the next several decades, despite being far superior to our actual timeline in terms of advanced technology, life in America and worldwide was rough. Many major countries would be wiped out entirely by deteriorated living conditions, climate change, and political destruction, and their people would flood into other nations, including the refugees of Haiti, many of which would later settle in Night City's Pacifica district and form the Voodoo Boys. Even within the United States, many major cities were obliterated, including New York, Pittsburgh, and Chicago. Countryside land was becoming increasingly unviable as farmland, and even hardened nomad clans relied on contracting work because natural, self-sustaining living was nearly impossible around the early to mid-21st century, especially around Night City, which just suffered from the mini-nuke Johnny Silverhand dropped in Arasaka Tower. All this is to say that there were a lot of people moving into geographically limited locations, which would be difficult to handle even with a competent and stable government, a luxury practically nobody had at this time. After a widespread abandonment of organized religion in the 90s, it is not unreasonable to assume that the continuing collapse of the natural world would push many away from faith in a benevolent God. While there are a number of religious sects and organizations in Cyberpunk 2077, many are not strictly concerned with a divine entity, and the remnants of Abrahamic religions are so scattered that they aren't especially relevant. Though perhaps if there was no God coming down to set things right, fix up the world, and give us another shot, perhaps our leaders would be able to turn things around. They would not. Jumping back to the first decade of the 21st century, the second nail in the coffin was hammered in: the explosion of privatized military forces for corporations and the start of the corporate wars. There's a lot I could go into and a lot of politics that concern Night City, but the important bit that I really want to hammer home is that corporate entities, many of which were arms developers, could build up literal armies and do war with other corporations. Whatever was left of actual governments at this point quickly proved to be too powerless or too corrupt to challenge this development, and thus began the corporation's rise to complete political control. Multiple full-scale wars between competing businesses would further devastate the world, causing massive oil pollution, displacement, and rampant destruction, further worsening the housing crisis. Even worse would be the corporate gentrification of many residential areas, forcing residents to sell their homes or straight up killing them to house their armies. With corporations actively making the world a worse place to live, and local and national governments being too shattered to deal with the situation, crime skyrocketed and Night City became one of the most dangerous places to live, especially considering its newfound independence from the new United States of America following the Unification War. Living conditions were so bad, there was so much war, so much atrocity, that people simply concluded that God, if in existence at all, cannot be benevolent. So if God won't protect us, our governments must, and they too have failed. Politicians are almost inherently not benevolent, and have proven to be mere henchmen for the next in line to the divine throne, corporations. This brings us to 2077, where the one true god of Night City is money. And with money comes power. And with power comes more money. And with more money comes eternal life. Okay, I jumped a few steps ahead on that one, but look at Saburo Arasaka, patriarch of the Arasaka Corporation and global superpower. Saburo is as close to the top as he could possibly be in the hierarchy of this world, as the head of one of the most powerful corps in the world. Throughout the game, we learn that the relic in V's head is a technology Arasaka was developing to bridge the gap between life and death. Rocker Boy and eco-terrorist Johnny Silverhand was captured, used as a test subject, and now lives on a data shard in your head 50 years after he died. By developing this technology, Saburo Arasaka was chasing immortality, chasing the divine. So, perhaps I misspoke at the beginning of this video. Night City is not a godless place, but it is a place full of man-made gods. Roughly hewn from the earth into a grotesque approximation of divinity, a crude mask of God worn by humans. 50 years later, Saburo's hubris gets the better of him and he is killed by his son, but it isn't an act of divine retribution. If there is a god, he had no answer to Saburo's insubordination. So Saburo kept on serving as a god, condemning Johnny to a digital afterlife, a virtual hell, effectively making him the arbiter of life and death, a god. Until his ambitious son took control of the company by killing him. So, okay, great. Night City has a corporate god and maybe an incorporeal god, and there is no shortage of suffering in Night City, so that's 2/3 of the problem evil, which, in case you forgot, is where we started this video. The next step is the assumption that God is all good, but this never really comes up in Cyberpunk 2077. Nobody makes that assumption. Nobody is asking how evil can exist. Without having to reconcile evil with benevolence, it is easy to draw the connection between an unfeeling God and an evil world. Society has moved past benevolence, it has moved past theodicy. The answer to the question of evil is that God is a dick. So far, I have almost exclusively talked about events before the actual game, and am largely making assumptions and inferences about how people feel in this world. So let's actually look at how this manifests in the game and look for some proof to substantiate my claim. So let's look at NC culture. Night City has one of the most comprehensive and cohesive implementations of culture in any video game I've ever played. It is both a natural evolution of American urban living and something that is also distinct and unique in and of itself. There are pervasive ways of thinking. The music actually references events and people from NC history and pop culture, and while so much of it is optional, these ideas are so ingrained into the identity of Night City that you'll feel it, even if you don't notice it.
Protection, my ass. Kick back and crank it to the max, Tooms. Here's some more tunes.
But when you do dive deep, there is a lot of interesting stuff to uncover, especially in relation to this question of theodicy. To start off, in the Warsaw Catholic Faith and its Origins, an in-world treatise, we discover a conservative sect of the Catholic Church that claims Poland as the chosen land. While the text does not itself explicitly express faith in a benevolent God, it implies belief in one at least, though maybe his love is conditional. The most interesting thing to glean from this text is the line, "God has tested Poland with great suffering as he tested Job." The reference to Job here is incredibly important because it does actually confirm one of the very few groups of people that have not entirely abandoned the idea of goodness in the divine. In the biblical book of Job, Job is a devout servant of God who is tested by the extreme means of God allowing all of his crops and animals and children to die. There are then three comforters who come and try to explain the suffering, saying things like, you must have deserved it, it could be worse. and other unsatisfying explanations of how a benevolent God would allow Job to suffer like this. The story ends with God revealing himself to Job and saying,
"Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me
if you have understanding.
Who determined its measurements? Surely you know.
Or who stretched the line upon it?" And a whole slew of other rhetorical questions, to which Job essentially responds, oh God, I'm just a little guy, I don't know any of that, sorry for questioning you. An endorsement of faith and trust. We humans think we know more than we do, but truly, we cannot fathom the scale at which God operates, and our sense of justice and goodness lacks that divine perspective. That's Job's theodicy. The Warsaw Catholics evidently consider themselves to be the chosen people, and while their God may have no mercy for other peoples, they at least believe in justice and redemption for the faithful. This also, of course, is relegated to Poland and does not actually detract from my claim about a post-theodic America, but I felt it needed acknowledgement regardless. Earth Reborn, another in-game data shard, opens with this. Our world is a world of people. Mankind has effectively eradicated any supernatural beings. Mythical beings, folkloric creatures, gods, even the monotheistic God. While my thesis permits the existence of the supernatural, this text echoes the general sentiment of my claim, and the general abandonment of the divine that is systematic in Night City. What is most important, though, is that mankind has eradicated any supernatural beings. Because humanity has not simply given up on God, we have actively driven him out. We have rejected him. God is dead, and we have paid him to fuck off. This active rejection of God is critical to moving beyond theodicy. Back to the real world, in Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, in the chapter Rebellion, Ivan makes a long argument about the extremity of human suffering, especially that of children, and ultimately arrives at the conclusion that I don't want harmony. From love for humanity, I don't want it. I would rather be left with the unavenged suffering. I would rather remain with my unavenged suffering and unsatisfied indignation, even if I were wrong. Besides, too high a price is asked for harmony. It's beyond our means to pay so much to enter on it. And so I hasten to give back my entrance ticket. And if I am an honest man, I am bound to give it back as soon as possible, and that I am doing. It's not God that I don't accept, Alyosha. Only I most respectfully return him the ticket. In an act that Alyosha labels rebellion, Ivan has claimed that the price, the suffering that God exacts, is not worth harmony, is not worth heaven, is not worth it. Even if he is wrong, Ivan would rather stand by his moral beliefs. If it is the heaven of a child-murdering God that awaits us, it is not a heaven I wish to go to. This idea naturally complements Earth Reborn. We may not have settled on the fact that there is no God, but we have decided that if there is one, we shall have nothing to do with him. We shall reject him. On a similar note, the poem America, a Prophecy says this. That stony law I stamp to dust, and scatter religion abroad to the four winds as a torn book, and none shall gather the leaves. That stony law being the Ten Commandments, this is another outright rejection of religion itself. This poem has very little to say about any actual god, but it is firmly against organized religion. The line, that pale religious lechery seeking virginity, condemns the moral obsession with sexual purity, positioning it as staunchly anti-religion. But this poem is not an outright rejection of spirituality. For everything that lives is holy. Life delights in life, because the soul of sweet delight can never be defiled. Much like Ivan, much like Earth Reborn, the author here stakes value in the sanctity of life itself and asserts that the guilt-laden philosophies of the old religions will hold people back no longer. In the song No Save Point by real-world artists Run the Jewels and Yankee the Brave, there's a line that goes,
I used to pray to God, but I think he took a vacation. Cause now the state of Cali is ran by these corporations. The skyscrapers shadow the homeless, the population.
While less of an act of rejection, this lyric still endorses the cultural shift away from a helping and kind God. He might be up there, but he isn't answering calls right now. Something I'd like to clarify about all this is that religion and spirituality are not dead in the NUSA, far from it. The Voodoo Boys practice what the game calls techno-mysticism. Esoteric spirituality is evidently popular. One of the first major characters you encounter runs an esoterica, and Buddhism is alive and well and relatively popular. There is also the cult of Santa Muerte. Born out of a fusion between Aztec Mayan and Spanish Catholicism dating back to the conquistadors, Santa Muerte in 2077 is a morally gray deity. Her devotees mainly consist of gangsters, prostitutes, and any other people who find themselves in constant danger. And for an appropriate offering, the Holy Mother supposedly makes no distinction between morally dubious and morally upright prayers. Seemingly unconcerned with love or justice, the Holy Mother of Death is a popular, but not benevolent, deity. Now, I believe I have pretty firmly established that the general feeling in Night City is that if there is a god, it wants nothing to do with us, if it doesn't actively want us to suffer. But as Earth Reborn states, only man remains, and man looked around and realized he was alone. In his loneliness, man felt the emptiness within him and started to repopulate it with things other than himself. That is how artificial intelligence was created. After sufficiently killing God, we needed another one. Humanity as a whole is not content without either having a god or playing as God. For Saburo, this was the quest for a second chance of life being revived by a copy of your consciousness on a USB stick in your head. But before all of that was AI. Now, I could do an entirely separate essay on the deification of artificial intelligence in Cyberpunk, but I briefly want to talk about the place it has in society and the place it has as a substitution for the divine. As of 2077, the old net is massively dangerous because of rogue AIs that pose legitimate danger to life and health. It's a little hard to imagine what this actually means, but let's take a look at the oceans in this timeline. Sea travel is entirely unviable because during the corporate wars, Arasaka developed AI sea mines that were designed to target enemy ships. But having no moral regulations, the AI determined it would be more efficient to blow up any ship they could because of the possibility that any ship could have enemy forces on board. Any attempt at patching out this behavior was rejected by the mines as viruses, and thus oceans became unusable because of the amoral bombs on the loose. These AIs are godlike, impossible to reason with, their actions are beyond our understanding, they have no feeling for humanity, only cold indifference. There are many in Night City who actively worship AI, but yet again, nobody is concerned with the question of benevolence. Whether it is the divine, corporate leaders, or artificial intelligence, nobody expects kindness from them. Now, the structure of this video has been a little atypical, and I'm breaking a little bit of academic conclusion etiquette here. Sorry, Professor. But anything I came up with to close this video seemed kind of trite. Like, great, you just wrote 10 pages of pseudo-academic work using fictional authors talking about fictional things. Okay. So let's wrap this up by looking at America pre-post the Odyssey. Eloquent. One of the most fascinating questions that came up in this research for me was one that I have yet to find the answer to. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did people lose faith in a benevolent God because people are so evil? Or did we stop expecting benevolence from people because God is so unfeeling? The in-world literature I've been looking at doesn't really answer this, so I started thinking about the real world. Where is America on this Theodicy timeline? Is this already in motion? Has this always been in motion? It seems like for the last several centuries, various thinkers have posited that God is dead, or that we have driven him out of the world, or that he stays in heaven because he too is afraid of what he's created. But the hope and belief, not just in a God, but in one that is good and loving, has always overpowered such notions. Despite the ever-growing atrocities and evils of the world, people are still asking why. Why is this happening to us? Why would a kind God allow this? So what causes people to stop asking that? How do we avoid Night City's fate? Should we avoid it?